Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 614, and today is June 13th, 2024. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. We have a lot of news, all of it dealing with Russia or Israel on today's show. So share the show if you can. I have added a lot of new followers for the show, more downloads, up 20% maybe or so over the past few weeks. I think this has something to do with doing a little bit shorter shows, trying to keep them between a half hour, really airing on the half hour side, but going up to 45 minutes, and additionally doing a show Monday through Friday. So if you guys have enjoyed this new process, please let me know, and I will continue to do it. But also you could just let me know by doing what you're doing, which is apparently sharing the show and putting it out there to more people. So you can find the show if you're new to it at the Libertarian Institute or on the blog at antiwar.com. It's up at YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee for the video version of the show, so subscribe on any of those platforms. We've been doing very well on Rumble recently, and then it's up anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts. And of course, you can follow me on Twitter, where I post this show and all the articles I write and all the other news that I think is important at Kyle Anzalone _. All right, everybody, let's get into it today. A lot to talk about here. U.S. shadowing Russian warships heading to Cuba. This one from Dave DeCamp, June 11th, antiwar.com. He writes, the U.S. Navy and Coast Guard are shadowing 3 Russian warships and a nuclear-powered submarine that are due to arrive in Cuba on Wednesday and will conduct military drills in the Caribbean Sea. A U.S. official told CBS News that 2 U.S. Navy destroyers and 2 ships that tow sonar equipment are shadowing the submarine, while another destroyer and a U.S. Coast Guard cutter are following 3 Russian ships, which include a frigate, a fleet oil tanker, and a tugboat. The U.S. ships will follow the Russian vessels to Cuba and wait for them to depart, and will continue to shadow them during the drills in the Caribbean Sea. A U.S. official said the drills would be the first simultaneous air and naval maneuvers Russia has carried out in the Caribbean since 2019. Both the frigate and the submarine are capable of carrying nuclear warheads, but Cuban officials have said they would not be armed with nuclear weapons. U.S. officials say they assessed this as well. The Pentagon framed the Russian deployment as, quote, routine, and said it does not pose a threat to the U.S. A Russian Navy ship docked in Havana last year, and according to Newsweek, Russian naval visits to Cuba happened every year from 2013 to 2020. But the White House has also acknowledged the deployment could be related to the U.S. involvement in Ukraine, which has significantly escalated tensions in recent weeks as President Biden has given Ukraine the green light to strike Russian territory with U.S. missiles. So this is from John Kirby, the White House National Security Advisor, and speaking with CBS News. Clearly, this is them sending signals of their displeasure about what we are doing in Ukraine. So we're going to watch it. We're going to monitor it. It's not unexpected. But we don't anticipate that there will be any imminent threat or any threat at all, quite frankly, to American national security in the region, in the Caribbean, or anywhere else. So I think this is important. I want to get into a little bit of my analysis here, that you have a situation here where my initial reaction is, the U.S. is going to blow this way out of proportion. They're really going to highlight this and draw a lot of attention to it. So Americans are afraid of Russia and will give more support to Ukraine. But I think actually the White House might be worried that the opposite will happen, that the whole idea of fighting them in Ukraine was we fight the Russians over there so we don't have to fight them over here. Americans don't want to be concerned at home that Russia or any other country threatens the U.S. in any way. And so this being a consequence of the war in Ukraine, I think the White House feels obliged to try to downplay it in order to not have Americans say, well, to be honest, we would rather not be involved in Ukraine if it means Russian warships coming over here. I do think this is a direct consequence of treating so many international bodies of water, the Black Sea, the Baltic Sea, the Pacific Ocean, as essentially American lakes that we could float our military equipment anywhere, fly our planes over those skies anywhere, and other countries have no right to object to them whatsoever. So, again, the American response here, I think, is due to trying not to have the American people upset about this. Another example of this as well is when Biden gave the warning that we were closer to nuclear war than any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis. He said that in a meeting to private donors. That's not the kind of thing that he has made a public statement of, because again, I think the American people's reaction to that isn't going to be, oh, we hate Russia, we want more war, we want to support the war in Ukraine more. It's actually going to be, well, this war in Ukraine is actually starting to hit us at home, which was the reason we were involved in this thing at first place, is to not have, anyone interfere in our near abroad. Like, so we're in Cuba, and so we're opposed to this. All right, next up here, this one, date to camp June 12th, antiwar.com. Stoltenberg says NATO is adapting its nuclear arsenal to current security environment. So NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said Wednesday that the alliance was discussing the adoption of its nuclear arsenal to the current security environment amid soaring tensions with Russia. He listed two examples of NATO's adaptation: the Netherlands acquiring F-35 fighter jets that could drop U.S. nuclear weapons stored in the country, and the U.S. modernizing its nuclear warheads that are deployed across Europe. Stoltenberg's comment marked a rare public discussion of NATO's nuclear arsenal from a top NATO official. Under NATO's nuclear sharing program, U.S. nuclear weapons are deployed to the Netherlands, Germany, Belgium, and Italy. However, two countries, Sweden and Poland, have floated the idea of adding themselves to those nuclear sharing programs recently. Both, I think, would probably be seen as highly provocative by Russia. So at least two of the countries that host U.S. nukes, Germany and the Netherlands, maintain a fleet of planes that could drop the bombs. France and the U.K. also have their own nuclear arsenals. Earlier this year, The Telegraph reported the U.S. was planning to deploy nuclear weapons to the U.K. for the first time since 2008. So Stoltenberg told reporters, there is not a new policy. This is a well-established procedure where the U.S. has nuclear bombs deployed in Europe, and where some allies take part in what we would call cold nuclear sharing, have planes that can deliver these weapons. Stoltenberg went on to call NATO's nuclear arsenal as the ultimate security guarantee. And honestly, it's, at this point, something that's going to drag the the world's people into a nuclear war and risk all of us living in a horrific hellscape of a world that's, plagued by nuclear fallout and blacked out skies and just mass death, suffering, starvation, all the things that would come along with nuclear war. So he also condemned Russia's deployment of nuclear weapons to Belarus, which Russia has compared to NATO nuclear sharing, and claimed NATO also faces a nuclear threat from China. He said, we also have to bear in mind that we don't only face nuclear challenges from Russia, but also from China, which is heavily modernizing its nuclear capabilities. Stoltenberg comments come amid Russian military drills that are simulating the use of tactical nuclear weapons, which Russian officials said were launched in direct response to the provocative rhetoric from Western officials and escalations in Ukraine. Stoltenberg has brushed off Russia warnings against NATO allowing its missiles to be used to strike Russian territory. There was a time in this war, in the very early days of the war, where the Biden administration and NATO officials are saying, like, we're going to give Ukraine some things like Javelin anti-tank missiles, Stinger. These are shoulder-fired weapons. These are massive systems, because we're worried that providing these massive systems and allowing Ukraine to have F-16s, Abrams tanks, HIMARS missiles that could strike Ukraine, cruise missiles from the UK. All these things were seen as red lines that could potentially lead to a nuclear war. But as NATO has slowly ratcheted up its support for Ukraine and the advanced military support we give Ukraine, Russia hasn't launched a nuclear war. And so the idiots in the White House, Sullivan, Blinken, Biden, Harris, all sit there and say, well, if we haven't crossed Russia's red line so far, then maybe Russia doesn't have a red line, and we'll just keep pushing it and pushing it and pushing it. And so I do think we're going to see more things like the Russian deployment to Cuba and them carrying out provocative war drills just, maybe 100 miles or so away from American borders, more war games between Russia, China, North Korea, maybe Iran, throw in other countries in the midst. More Russian support for maybe its allies or the groups it sees as its allies across the Middle East. Maybe some of those groups will strike American targets across the Middle East. And of course, the U.S. has a lot of, what we would consider civilian infrastructure, gas pipelines, internet cables under the sea, things like that Russia could also attack. I think the Nord Stream pipeline attack kind of would give Russia what it sees as the green light to do that. All right, next up here, this one from Dave DeCamp, a major announcement of U.S. weapon shipments to Ukraine. U.S. to send another Patriot missile battery to Ukraine. So President Biden has approved the delivery of another Patriot missile defense system to Ukraine, the New York Times reported on Tuesday. The system is being pulled out of Poland and will be the second Patriot battery the U.S. has sent to Ukraine. It could be deployed to the front lines within the next several days. Germany and the Netherlands have also provided Ukraine with one Patriot missile system each and are in talks to supply a second. The U.S. has been sending a steady supply of Patriot missiles to Ukraine since the first sending the battery in 2023. Ukrainian troops have been training on how the advanced missile systems are used at the U.S. military base in Oklahoma. The news comes after President Zelensky and other Ukrainian officials have been pleading for the U.S. to send more Patriot systems, of which there are a limited supply. Zelensky has said that Ukraine needs two batteries in Kharkiv to defend itself against the Russian offensive in the region. Describing his frustration with the lack of Patriot systems in April, Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba said, "I feel myself hitting the wall with my own head. Although I am a diplomat and that means I had to dismantle the wall brick by brick, but since this kind of diplomacy doesn't work, I feel like hitting the wall. I just don't understand why it's not happening." And as Dave alluded to earlier in his article, it's really a supply issue. I did note that the last weapons package the U.S. provided to Ukraine didn't even include Patriot interceptors. So I do wonder if this system is a replacement of a Patriot system somewhere in Ukraine that was already provided by the U.S., Germany, or Netherlands that had been destroyed by Russia, or if this is an additional system that will allow Ukraine to either defend more of its critical infrastructure, maybe another city, or again, as Dave indicates there, deploy near the front lines to try to defend his frontline troops from some of the Russian bombs that are raining down on them. All right, next up, this one, Dave DeCamp, June 12th, antiwar.com. U.S. Ukraine to sign long-term military deal at G7. So President Biden and Ukrainian President Zelensky are expected to sign a deal for a long-term U.S. military assistance for Ukraine. On the sidelines, they have a Group of Seven or G7 summit that begins in Italy on Thursday. According to CNN, the deal will commit the U.S. to 10 years of arming and training Ukrainian military and helping build up the country's military-industrial complex. The agreement is not expected to specify the amount the U.S. will spend on supporting Ukraine. So it's interesting here because I think initially the White House really wanted to do a deal here that would what they called Trump-proof the aid to Ukraine, which means basically lock in the U.S. to fighting this proxy war in Ukraine for another decade, through the Trump presidency and whatever president comes next. The American people would be locked into providing the support for Ukraine. This is what Washington wanted. But this deal could be easily reversed by a future administration, as it will be an executive agreement and not a military treaty, which requires the approval of the Senate. Initial reports about the plan said the idea would be to tie the hands of a future president and make it difficult for the U.S. to stop supporting Ukraine. So a little bit of good news here. We will see how this all plays out later in the week. I expect I will either talk about this on Friday's show or Monday's show, just depending on what day of the G7 summit this all gets announced. Now, there is another thing that is expected to be announced at the G7 summit, and that is this plan to give Ukraine a $50 billion loan. And they're going to get that loan, and then it's going to be paid back over time using the income made off of the interest of Russia's frozen central bank assets. And so I'm not quite sure how this is going to work, where this loan is actually going to be paid back. especially if there's any interest on this loan whatsoever. They only anticipate the Russian funds generating, I think, 3 to 3.5% of interest every year. So that's $3.5 billion or so, or I guess more than that. So 3 to 5%. And I imagine the terms of the loan are going to have to be, I mean, the Fed lending rate right now is 5.2%. And so this is going to have to take 30, 40 years to pay off. I think one of the real things we'll have to see in this loan is, first of all, who's giving the loan. If it's financial institutions, if it's the US, I guess if it's the US, they could, just not have Ukraine pay interest on the loan or something like that. All that's possible, but still, we're talking about decades to pay this off. Even if they were just taking all the interest generated off of these funds and giving it right to Ukraine, or right to this loan, and there was no interest. I mean, we're still talking about decades to pay it off. And it seems unlikely that Ukraine is going to be in a position anytime soon where they're not going to need more money. And so this is not a very good financial loan. And there has to be two options here. One is that the US is going to give Ukraine the loan from their bank, our own treasury, and then we're just going to forgive the loan in 5, 10, 15 years or whatever like that. I think the other option is, and they've talked about this in the past, is making the collateral for this loan the $200 to $300 billion in frozen Russian central bank funds. And in that case, they would then seize those funds in order to pay back the loan, which is essentially just taking $50 billion of the Russian frozen funds, which is what the European Union wants to avoid in a lot of these European countries, because they hold almost all of the funds. So I see this as being highly problematic. Now, it does seem that Russia has maybe formed a course that they want to pursue here, which is they're going to start seizing European American assets of G7 countries. So, that can include Canada, Australia, Japan, South Korea, maybe things like that. And they're going to use those seized assets to recoup the losses of the stolen money, although I'm not sure if Russia has 50, 100, 200 billion dollars of Western assets that they're currently holding on to. All right, this one I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on June 11th. Finnish forces conduct first NATO deployment. For the first time since joining the alliance last year, Finland had deployed its fighter jets to another NATO nation. When Helsinki joined the bloc, it ended a decades-long policy of neutrality and doubled the length of the border between NATO and Russia. On Tuesday, 7 Finnish F-18s joined Romanian and British fighter jets in Romania for operations. So a Finnish air commander said, "I'm sure that during this enhanced air policing, air shielding mission, our integration into NATO will take a big leap forward. We as a team will have learned a lot, and all this will boost NATO deterrence and defense." The U.S. and its allies have touted the expansion of Finland and Sweden as a consequence of Russia's war in Ukraine. However, Russian President Vladimir Putin has downplayed the importance of the Nordic states joining the bloc and explained that Moscow would not have a military response unless Stockholm or Helsinki hosted NATO weapons. It appears that the bloc is planning to deploy its military forces to NATO Nordic states. The U.S. signed a pact with Finland that gave the American soldiers access to 15 Finnish bases. Additionally, a top Swedish official said his country was open to hosting NATO nuclear weapons. Russia has warned that expanding NATO's presence in Finland and Sweden will increase tensions. Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson, explained, "This will certainly lead to tensions. We can only regret this. We had excellent relations with Finland. No one threatened anyone. There was no problems or complaints against each other. No one infringed on anybody's interests. There was mutual respect." And so it seems like that has gone away. All right, let's get into the news here today about what's going on in Gaza and the U.S. relationship with Israel. This one here from Dade DeCamp, June 12th, antiwar.com. Blinken slams Hamas response to ceasefire proposal. So Secretary of State Antony Blinken on Wednesday slammed Hamas's response to the Gaza ceasefire proposal, claiming some of the Palestinian group's conditions were not workable. Blinken made the comments in Doha alongside the Qatari Prime Minister. And Blinken said Hamas has proposed numerous changes to the proposal that was on the table. Some of those changes are workable, some are not. Hamas' response contained amendments to the proposal that would give stronger assurances that Israel would agree to a permanent ceasefire and the withdrawal of its troops from Gaza, since the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has repeatedly rejected those ideas. Israeli officials previously said Netanyahu's public opposition to a permanent ceasefire would likely sabotage the chances of a deal. But Blinken and other U.S. officials are putting all the blame on the lack of a deal on Hamas and claiming Israel accepted the ceasefire proposal. Blinken said Hamas could have answered with a single word, yes. Instead, Hamas waited nearly 2 weeks and then proposed more changes, a number of which go beyond positions it had previously taken. He added that as a result of the Hamas response, the Israeli slaughter and starvations of the Palestinians in Gaza will go on and more people will suffer. Blinken didn't go as far as Israeli officials who commented to the media that Hamas's response and claimed that the Palestinian group rejected the ceasefire proposal, which signals it is not interested in continuing the negotiations. So I want to get into this just a little bit more, because I think this is maybe one of the most nefarious pieces of propaganda I have ever seen the U.S. government put together. So a few weeks ago, President Joe Biden announced this proposal that said Israel had come to an agreement with the U.S. that they would agree to a permanent ceasefire in Gaza, withdrawal of forces, and eventually rebuilding Gaza in exchange for the release of hostages. And Biden also made this weird claim that doesn't actually appear to be a part of the deal, that the deal would see Hamas be eliminated. One problem with Hamas signing on to a deal is that they're probably not going to sign onto a deal that actually eliminates the group. So I think that was a little bit concerning. Now, I think very quickly it became obvious, I should say first, that Israel had not signed on to or came up with this deal. And the Israeli government had made it very clear that they would not agree to a permanent ceasefire or to end the military campaign until Hamas was destroyed. And so there's two possibilities here. One is that the Israeli government lied to President Joe Biden and said, oh yeah, sure, we'll agree to this. And then Joe Biden went out and made the statement. And the second possibility, which I think is more likely, is that the U.S. government put out this statement believing that this would tie Netanyahu's hands and really force him to accept this deal that the White House, thought would sound good to the Israeli people. And they would say, oh yeah, we should agree to that. So those are the two options. Not sure what piece it is. But very quickly, it became clear, again, that the Israelis had not signed on to this deal. And so for Hamas to not immediately say yes, they said they received it positively, but for them not to immediately say yes for a couple of reasons. One, it's hard for the group's political leadership that's based in Qatar to be able to negotiate, or not negotiate, but talk with even the Hamas military leadership in Gaza due to, all the disruptions that the military campaign that's ongoing, it's probably the cause of some of the delay. But two, the Israeli government was making statements during that time that really cast doubt on their seriousness on the commitment to the deal. And so that the Hamas, again, with their limited and slow communications, would take 2 weeks to form the language that they want to see to make sure that this is a permanent ceasefire and not a just 6 weeks. Hamas releases 95% of the captives that they have, and then the Israelis go back to bombing and destroying Gaza with no fear that they would kill essentially any of their own people. It is a real possibility here, and something that Hamas, I think, is rightfully concerned about. And so when Hamas says, okay, we're going to respond positively to this deal. We saw what you have put forward. This is what we put forward. And then, the American media, I saw this a lot. Jay Tapper did this. The Israeli government did this. And Blinken essentially did too, is they throw their hands in the air and they say, oh, we offered the Palestinians a great deal and they just won't take it. This is just like the Palestinians. They never miss a chance to miss a chance. And had they just taken this deal, the suffering of the Palestinian people would end. But just those darned Hamas are so committed to killing Israelis and killing Jews that they won't accept this great ceasefire deal that would end the suffering of the Palestinian people. And so Israel's just going to keep on bombing. And that's not the fault of the Israelis or the Americans who provide them with the arms, but all the fault of Hamas. And that's, the narrative that's playing out. And so you almost wonder if the Biden administration knew this from the start and just played out this narrative just like this. That way, when more beheaded Palestinian children come across your feeds, people are conditioned to think, well, if Hamas just stopped the fighting, this would all be over, and there was no pressure on the Israelis or the Americans to end their part in this just absolutely gruesome and awful war. All right, next up here. Israeli Rafah operations cut off medical care for 3,000 Palestinian children suffering malnutrition. So according to UNICEF, that's the UN Agency for Children, almost 3,000 children have been cut off for treatment from moderate and severe acute malnutrition in southern Gaza, putting them at risk of death as harrowing violence and displacement continues to impact access to healthcare facilities and services for desperate families. This number, based on reporting from UNICEF's nutrition partners, equates to approximately 3/4 of the 3,800 children who were estimated to be receiving life-saving care in the south ahead of the escalating conflict in Rafah. And so we've talked about this in the past on the show. When kids get into the situation, especially young kids, children under 5, we're really talking about infants, toddlers here, get into a situation where they are moderate or severely malnourished, you can't just start feeding them food. I mean, obviously they could try to eat food, but a lot of times it would make them more sick, and they need, a specific, very nutrient rich diet. I think it's largely based on peanut butter and a few other things that really helps them to recover the calories they need and start developing. Now, first of all, the Israelis are inflicting irreparable damage on these children. We do know this, that children who face this level of malnourishment, they will never recover once they start to experience wasting. And so these children will likely be stunted, which means not only will they be shorter and maybe their body's a little bit disproportionate, but also this comes with other lifelong health conditions, increased risk of heart attacks and other heart issues. But also there's a lot of cognitive issues here, decrease in intellectual and cognitive functioning, more likely, addictive behaviors, violent behaviors growing up. And so, it's very, very important, as I'm sure anybody in this country with a kid knows, that you have to not only get your kid food every day, but the right kinds of food, the right vitamins. And this is what allows them to develop to their full potential. And, it's not even that these children just aren't getting all the nutrients and vitamins and all the other, medical care that they should be getting at a young age, but that they're actively being deprived of it and being thrown into a situation of wasting where, again, they're never actually going to be able to recover from what Israel has inflicted upon them here. I mean, this is an entire generation of young Palestinians. And, we're mainly talking about the children, again, under the age of 5, although the malnourishment certainly will have lifelong implications for, children probably up to the age of 16 or so. But when you look at the number of children in Gaza, 1 million of them, I mean, this is just a horrible, horrible plague that the United States and Israel are inflicting on an entire generation of Palestinian children, 1 million of them. I mean, it's just, it's one of the most sick and twisted things that you read about. And this is really one of the things when this was happening in Yemen that really drove me to want to become an anti-war activist, just because doing this to so many children is just so horrific, not to mention all the other like kind of PTSD and other trauma that's piled on top of not being able to eat. So back to the UNICEF press release here. The looming risk of more vulnerable children falling to malnutrition is also a concern. While there has been a slight improvement in the delivery of food aid in the north, humanitarian access in the south has declined dramatically. Early results from recent malnutrition screenings in the middle and southern governance of Gaza indicate that the cases of moderate and severe malnutrition have risen since the second week of May, when aid delivery and humanitarian access was significantly curtailed by the escalation of the Rafah offensive. So this is UNICEF Regional Director for the Middle East and North Africa, Adele Cord. Horrific images continue to emerge from Gaza of children dying before their families' eyes due to the continued lack of food, nutritional supplies, and the destruction of healthcare services. Unless treatment can begin quickly resumed for 3,000 children, they are at immediate and serious risk of becoming critically ill, acquiring life-threatening complications, and joining the growing list of boys and girls who have been killed in this senseless man-made deprivation. The risk of rising cases of malnutrition comes at the same time as malnutrition treatment services are collapsing. Today, only 2 of the Gaza Strip's 3 stabilization centers that treat severely malnourished children are functioning. Meanwhile, plans for operating new centers have been delayed due to the ongoing military operations across the Strip. Treating a child for acute malnutrition typically takes 6 to 8 weeks of uninterrupted care and requires special therapeutic food, safe water, and other medical support. Malnourished children are at higher risk of catching diseases and other health issues due to limited access to safe water, sewage overflows, infrastructure damage, and a lack of hygiene items. Water production in the Gaza Strip is now less than a quarter of what was produced prior to the intensification of hostilities in October. Our warnings, this is back to the regional director, our warnings of mounting child deaths from preventable combination of malnutrition, dehydration, and disease should immobilize immediate action to save children's lives, and yet this devastation continues. With hospitals destroyed, treatment stopped, and supplies scant, we are posing for more child suffering and deaths. Since October 2023, UNICEF has reached tens of thousands of women and children with prevention and treatment services for malnutrition, including ready-to-use therapeutic food, ready-to-use instant infant formula, and preventative high-energy biscuits and micronutrient supplements for pregnant women containing iron and essential nutrients. This is again Cord, the regional director. UNICEF has more nutrition supplies preposition to arrive in Gaza Strip if access allows. UN agencies are seeking assurances that humanitarian operations can safely collect and distribute aid to the children and their families without interruption. We need better operating conditions on the ground with more safety and less restrictions, but ultimately is a ceasefire that children need most. All right, just a few more stories here today. This one I wrote for the Institute on June 12th. UN report details Israeli war crimes committed during first months of war on Gaza. So this was the UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry, or the COI, and it provided a detailed analysis of the Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th and the Israeli assault on Gaza. The report found both sides committed war crimes, but concludes there was no evidence to support the claim that Hamas engaged in mass rape during its rampage in southern Israel. The COA found evidence of Israel intentionally killing civilians and Israeli forces engaging in acts of sexual torture. So the report's analysts of the events on October 7th concluded Hamas intentionally targeted 24 civilian targets, leading to hundreds of deaths. The COI found evidence that members of Hamas committed sexual assault on Israelis, with some female bodies found in various states of address. However, the report debunks the widespread claim that top Israeli and U.S. officials have often repeated that Hamas has engaged in acts of mass rape during its attack. So this is from the Commission report. The commission has reviewed testimonies obtained by journalists and the Israeli police concerning rape, but has not been able to independently verify such allegations. Additionally, the commission found some specific allegations to be false and inaccurate or contradictory with evidence or statements and discounted these from the assessment. So while the assertion that Hamas engaged in mass rape on October 7th has been widely discussed in the U.S. media, the Palestinian accusations that Israeli forces have systematically engaged in horrific sexual violence have largely gone unreported. The COI found evidence to bat the Palestinian claims that Israel is engaging in systematic sexual torture and humiliation. So the report says, based on the testimonies and verified video footage and photographs, the commission finds that sexual violence has been perpetrated throughout the Israeli enforced evacuation process. Palestinians were made to watch members of their family and community strip in public and walk completely or partially undressed while subjected to sexual harassment. The Israeli forces inflicted sexual torture on males. According to the COI, it explains, males were repeatedly filmed and photographed by soldiers while subject to forced public stripping and nudity, sexual torture, and inhumane or cruel treatment. The COI concluded that the Israeli forces were allowed to engage in, or authorized to, like explicitly told to, engage in the sexual abuse. The commission concludes that the forced public stripping and nudity and other types of abuse by Israeli military personnel were either ordered or condoned. These acts were intended to humiliate and degrade the victims and the Palestinian community at large by perpetuating gender stereotypes that create a sense of shame, subordination, and emasculinity and infuriety. Additionally, the commission found evidence that Israeli forces have been given the authority to target civilians. So the authors of the report conclude, given information suggesting relatively low numbers of Hamas militants in proportion to the wider civilian population, and given Israel's repeated assertion that militants are embedded within the civilian population, the report concludes, statements indicate that the Israeli government has given Israeli security forces blanket authorization to target civilian locations widely and indiscriminately in the Gaza Strip. The COI recommends an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, something the White House has resisted over the past 8 months. Last month, President Joe Biden unveiled a ceasefire proposal he claimed originated in Tel Aviv. However, Prime Minister Netanyahu has continued to dismiss the idea of a permanent end to the conflict. The U.S. has significant leverage over Israel and could condition future aid to Tel Aviv on Netanyahu ending the onslaught. Nevertheless, Biden has refused to place any meaningful restrictions on arms shipments to Tel Aviv. Now, a second part of this report that I didn't get into in my article there was written up by Middle East Eye. UN report finds at least 14 Israelis likely intentionally killed by Israeli forces executing the Hannibal Directive. So Middle East Eye reports at least 14 Israelis were likely intentionally killed by the Israeli army on October 7th as part of a protocol aimed at preventing the capture. A new United Nations human rights report has found. The report from the COI documented repeated uses of the so-called Hannibal Directive on October 7th as Israel was combating Hamas fighters who entered southern Israel from Gaza. The main directive, when active, indicates that the Israeli army should use any and all means to prevent the capture of Israeli soldiers, even if it involves killing them, even though the secret directive was publicly revoked in 2016. Several Israeli outlets have reported that the actions and the rhetoric of the army during the Hamas-led attack implied that it was reactivated in some form on October 7th. The COI said it had confirmed one statement from an Israeli security force tank crew, confirming that the crew had applied the Hannibal Directive by shooting at a vehicle which they suspected was transporting an abducted Israeli soldier. All right, last article here today. This one, Human Rights Watch blasts White House over claims U.S. has not viewed evidence of tortured Palestinians. So Middle East Eye reports a leading Human Rights Watch group has lashed out against the Biden administration for saying it has no information on recent reports of Israel torturing Palestinian detainees at a military base in the Negev Desert. So this is Sarah Yeager, and she's the Washington director for Human Rights Watch. She said, the fact that the United States government appears not to have information from the Israeli government on detention conditions and torture allegations is remarkable and wrong. Clearly, U.S. officials should have eyes on the Israeli conduct. If they truly don't, that needs to change, including knowing whether or not detainees are being tortured. She added, noting that the U.S. weapons have been supporting Israel throughout their campaign in Gaza. Over the past several weeks, several U.S. media outlets have reported that Israeli detention centers have been using torture on Palestinian detainees. Most recently, the New York Times published a 3-month-long investigation of Palestinians at one facility. The report found systematic sexual abuse and torture perpetrated against the detained Palestinians, including one account that treatment revealed one detainee died after they put an electric stick up his anus. So they're just doing absolutely the most horrific things you could think of to the Palestinians, and the Americans just simply don't care. All right, everybody, that's where I'm going to wrap up the show today. Thank you all so much for tuning in, all the support you've been giving me, especially over the past couple weeks, as the numbers of the show have really seen a pretty significant escalation. So, I really appreciate it. I'm always a little overwhelmed that there's so many people that take the time to listen to my show, especially now that I'm putting it out every day. And, yeah, if you shared, I really appreciate it, and thank you all for listening. If you're a new listener, you like the show, subscribe to it somewhere, and find all my work at the Libertarian Institute, antiwar.com, and on Twitter at @KyleAnzalone_.